All right, guys, good morning. Should be Monday, November 14th for you. So I'm talking to you in the future. Just want to give you a rundown of what we're going to do today. So we can see on Google Classroom, we have this population story assignment. But before we do that, we need to take some notes to kind of finish up some of our population vocab. So that's where we'll start. I'll come back. We're going to talk about this assignment. Pretty easy. It's just basically you're going to be writing a story using the new vocab that we've learned. Okay. So let's go ahead. If you want to use this video to take notes off of, or if you'd rather open up the slides and take notes, basically what I'm envisioning is you'll pause the video as I'm talking, add stuff to your notes that you need, and then kind of continue and work through the video to get the notes that you need. Okay. So where I want to start is if you think back to last Thursday, we talked about this idea of exponential growth, right? And we see a population that's growing exponentially. That's how we describe growth that is increasing year after year after year, regardless of population. Okay, so we have exponential growth. Then we answered the question. We said, well, can this continue forever? And we said, no, it can't. Exponential growth will eventually slow down. And when that does, we see what we call logistical growth. Okay. And so we talked about that and we said, okay, we start to see that change in population. It might still be growing, but it's really going to slow down and start to level off. Okay. And we got our three phases, right? So we got exponential growth first. Then as it slows, we're still going to be increasing population, but it's going to really slow down in the rate that we increase. And then finally, that population stabilizes. Okay, so we should have this all in our notes. So now, what do we call that when it stabilizes? Once we reach this point where we have the right amount of resources, the right amount of predators, right amount of prey, in an area, we get to this kind of happy homeostasis. Okay, and what we call that is carrying capacity. Okay, so let's go ahead and add this to your notes. So carrying capacity is just the maximum number of individuals of a particular species in a particular environment. Okay, that the environment can support. So you can see with our graph here, right? For whatever reason, we see this huge growth in population. Okay, and as we reach that carrying capacity, our growth is going to start to slow down, and usually we overshoot, right? And then we see some die-offs, right? For whatever reason, we see this growth. We're gonna see the opposite effect, and we're gonna see some die-offs, and then that population will recover, and then eventually we just start to see kind of some just small peaks and valleys at that carrying capacity. Okay, so for example. Um, they took wolves out of Yellowstone. Okay, very key predator. And so what we saw was elk population really shot up for a while, eventually to the point where they are now being affected by the number of resources that they have. Okay, and like we've talked about, if you don't have resources available, you are eventually going to get to the point where some of those organisms begin to die due to starvation, disease, those type of things, and that population would correct. Now we can see that carrying capacity now without the wolves is much higher, right? This is their new carrying capacity, and so we'd see that elk population last year. Okay, so carrying capacity is just basically okay, how much life can we support in a given habitat? Okay, now. Again, if you need to pause this video, you don't have to take notes as fast as I'm talking. So now what causes this? What causes these populations to slow down, to not grow exponentially, or to decrease? We call those the limiting factors. Okay, so what a limiting factor is what causes the population growth to decrease, right? To slow down. And we know these, right? We've talked about it with our game as we were grabbing beads. If we increase the amount of competition, eventually we saw more and more of our organisms die off, right? There's not enough resources to support that many. Predation, right? Getting rid of a predator, introducing a new predator into an ecosystem. Those things are going to affect your population. Parasites, right? We just got done talking about symbiotic relationships. So parasitism, usually with parasites, a lot of disease tends to follow that. And then we also have things where our resources are affected. Okay, whether it's from drought, whether it's from human disturbances, things that are not a result of that population of those species. So we really can break these down into two big categories. So we have our density independent factors and our density dependent factors. So again, density, we want to think of, okay, density in any form of science is the amount in a given area, right? So with this, it's the amount of organisms or the population of organisms in a certain area, right? So as we add organisms to that area, we don't really necessarily increase the area. So our density is going to go up, our population density. Same thing, if we look at somewhere terrible and horrible like Denver or California, that density, that population density is extremely high, right? Whereas you go somewhere nice like Wyoming, the density or the number of people in a given space is much, much lower. That was my dog Finley. So now we can break these. What do these have to do? How do we determine whether it's density dependent or density independent? Well, these things, competition, right? If we are increasing competition, that is a result of the number of organisms in an area. Okay, it is a result of that population. So it's dependent on the density of that population. Same thing with predation. The number of predators, the number or amount of prey is going to determine that limiting factor. So it has to do directly with the density of those organisms. Now, on the other hand, density independent, right? So if you, right now, you guys are all dependent on your parents or guardians, okay? When you become independent, that means you don't rely on them. So what this is saying is this density independent is when we no longer rely on the population, or we see a change that isn't a result of the population, okay? So what would that be? We could have a perfect amount of organisms in an area, perfect carrying capacity, everybody's happy. However, we get a drought. Okay. That drought had nothing to do with the number of organisms in that area. Okay, but will it affect them? Yeah, right. We don't produce as much producers. We have limited food sources. Those organisms begin to suffer. Okay, human disturbances. Right, we go in and we build a housing development right along a river and destroy that habitat for them. That had nothing to do with the population of the organisms that live there. So it is independent of the population. So that's what these two are. So an example of this, if we look at this nice muley here, an example of how mule deer population could be affected by a density dependent factor is it says the population of deer increase in an area, increasing the competition for resources like food and water. This causes many of the deer to die of starvation, slowing or limiting that population growth, right? So it was because we increased the number of deer that there was not enough food source available that was directly dependent on the population of deer. It results in some of them dying and slowing growth. Now, exact same results, but we say an unusually long and cold winter resulted in a significant food shortage, causing many of the deer to die of starvation and slowing and limiting population growth, right? So we can see it's the exact same result or change in population, but one of them is because of the deer population got too big. The other one is a factor that had nothing to do with the population. So what I usually think of as density independent is something that changed resources. Okay, you change the physical environment in which these organisms live. Density dependent is going to be the organisms themselves are changing. They're changing in their population. Okay, so that's kind of our notes for today. So make sure we have all that added. Oh, I lied. We got one more slide. Okay. So how does this population change? How do we look at this overall? We can really break it down into two things that increase populations, two things that decrease populations. Okay. So immigration, we're probably more familiar with this term, right? So that's just species moving into an area. So you might be like, what the heck? How do organisms immigrate? Well, let's take this scenario, right? We have a nice riparian area next to a river. We decide to build a neighborhood there. Well, those organisms, we're not literally killing those organisms, but as we move in, as we encroach on their territory, they need to move. Okay. And so as they move, they are going to be immigrating into a new habitat, right? And so if that habitat is already existing and you have an influx of new organisms, that would be an example of where we see immigration. Now, okay, we can tie that into, okay, well, that's going to cause population to go up. That's going to cause competition to go up, and we have more competition for resources. Okay. Births, that one makes sense, right? If we have a lot of resources available, organisms are reproducing at a high rate, they're going to breed and produce more offspring, right? And then that's going to cause an increase in population. Decrease is emigration, right? So it's just the opposite. So species leaving an area. We can see this seasonally with migratory birds, right? So we see a mass immigration of ducks coming south as it gets colder, right? But then as the spring and summertime hits and they're moving up to the northern territories for reproduction, we're going to see them leave that area, right? So we might see a dense competition for resources during a short period of time, but then during other months we might see a lot less competition. So emigration, right, is them going to be just the opposite of immigration. Okay, and then finally, of course, we know deaths, right? So deaths, birth and death are really going to be a big factor here as well, right? So if we are having more offspring, and the rate at which the population is growing versus the rate at which they're dying, if that growth rate or birth rate is higher, we're going to see that population increase. If you get to a point where now we have a high number of deaths and it is outpacing our birth rate, we're going to start to see that population decrease. So we look at these things in total and say, okay, how many organisms move into an area, how many organisms are born in a given time frame, and then we look at how many have left the area, how many die. And then we can say, okay, is that population actually growing? Is it staying the same, or is it decreasing? Okay, and that's how we look at that. So now let's real quick look at our population story assignment. So basically what you guys are going to do is you're going to choose an organism and you're going to write a story about it. It could be a happy story like Bambi. It could be a sad story. Don't write too many sad stories. I'm emotionally fragile. But basically you are going to explain how this population or this organism or species has experienced population change. Okay, and to do that, we want to use our vocab words that we just learned about. But we need to connect our vocab words with actual scenarios that could lead to that. So we got to connect it with some of these ideas like competition, predation, those things. Okay. So you're going to write a story. You're going to tell a wonderful tale about that involves population change. So you got 5 vocab words we got to use: exponential growth, logistical growth, carrying capacity, density dependent factor, density independent factor. So you'll look on here and it says, okay, explanation of what caused exponential growth, right? So you say, oh man, white-tailed buck deer, we saw them experience exponential growth. Now, why? What happened that led to that exponential growth? Oh, they banned hunting, or they got rid of wolves, or something like that. Okay. Then logistical growth, same thing. Oh, those white-tailed buck deer, right? That population was growing like crazy, and they ate up all the crops, and there wasn't enough food. So eventually, that exponential growth slowed, right? So you got to explain what is leading to that. We have to have something realistic that's going to lead to that. Carrying capacity, and then density dependent factor, right? So like any of the ones that we talked about, what was that limiting factor? Okay, and then choose maybe a density independent factor as well. What changed in that habitat to change that population? Okay, big thing is, as you're writing this, keep track of your 5 vocab words by underlining them, right? Then you know you use them, which is good. And then for Pete's sake, please, 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 when you are done, take a picture and turn it in on Google Classroom. Okay. All right, guys, that's it for today. I hope you have a great day. We will see you on Wednesday.